Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. I hope you all are doing well. So, today we are going to talk about one of the important topics in sociolinguistics, conversation analysis. Before I begin with the topic conversation analysis, let me explain briefly what is planned versus unplanned speech. Some speech is planned. For example, public performances such as commencement addresses, or sometimes we will rehearse a contribution ahead of time for a conversation of great significance. But anyone who has done this knows the conversation then rarely proceeds as planned. Casual conversations are not choreographed to any extent ahead of time and occur in real time. However, such unplanned speech does exhibit certain characteristics. For instance, repetitions, simple active sentences, speaker and listener combining to construct propositions, stringing of clauses together with and or but, or the juxtapositioning of clauses with no overt links at all, deletion of subjects and reference, and use of words such as this, that, here, and there. This may also be filled with hedges, that is, words and expressions such as well, like, maybe, but, sort of, I guess, and so on. The syntax of unplanned conversation is also not at all that of formal, edited, written prose. It is composed of utterances that are often fragmented and overlapping. These are not the complete, non overlapping sentences, which we carefully organize into larger units like the paragraphs, sections, and chapters of a book, such as this one. Now, whatever I just said, that was about planned speech. Let's see what is unplanned speech then. Unplanned speech, however, is not unorganized speech. Unorganized speech would be speech in which anything goes. We obviously cannot say anything to anyone at any time. Nor, as we will see, can we say what we say in any way that we please. There are specific procedures we must follow as we indulge in the give and take of conversation. So, this conversation between planned and unplanned speech gave rise to what is known as conversation analysis. Its gurus include Sachs, Shegloff, and Jefferson. Conversational and analysts working within the ethno-methodological tradition point out that regardless of how many speakers are involved in a conversation, speakers take turns of various lengths with very little overlap, and turn taking is usually smooth even though it is quite unordered. Further, there appears to be a built-in repair system known to all participants. Consequently, they examine how people manage conversations, how talk proceeds in turns, how one utterance relates to another, often in a paired relationship, how topics are introduced, developed, and changed, and so on. So, basically, what is conversation analysis? That it focuses on how you introduce certain topics, how you develop them, then how you change them. And it also talks about how talk proceeds in turns. For instance, when you speak in a group or in a gathering, how you take your turn, how you know you are supposed to speak, and how one utterance relates to another, often in a pairing relationship. We will talk about all these things in detail in a while. So, their concern is the very orderliness of talk. They regard conversation as skilled work in which we all necessarily participate. Their goal is to explain that order and those skills. So, as far as conversation analysis is concerned, it is an inductive approach and requires a close analysis of large bodies of tape and video recorded naturalistic data. So basically in conversation analysis or CA, the abbreviation is, so unlike in linguistic ethnography or in interactional sociolinguistics, the focus is solely on the recorded data and transcripts. Any conclusions investigators draw must emerge exclusively from these data. And the primary goal of CA or conversation analysis is to unveil conversational structure and its underlying principles. So there are certain principles of conversation analysis that we will talk about in this particular presentation. It is also sometimes said that conversations are locally managed. That is, they proceed without any conscious plan, and the participants simply rely on using the principles that are available to them to achieve any wider objectives they have. So, there is a researcher, Liddycoat, who says what participants say is shaped by and for the context in which it occurs, and each next bit of talk is understood in the light of what has preceded it. So, this contextualization is an important procedure for understanding conversational contributions. Each turn and talk is the response to some previous talk. So, for instance, when you say, I'm doing okay, it means somebody has asked you, how are you doing? So, basically, it's a result, it's a consequence of something that has been asked. And by its utterance, provides a context in which the next turn at talk will be heard. So, conversationalists design their talk to demonstrate the sense they have made of the preceding talk and display, through the construction of their talk, their understanding of the talk so far. So, dear students, in this particular presentation or lecture, we are going to talk about some of the principles of conversation analysis. Though it's a vast topic, conversation analysis, but for the sake of this particular lecture, we will be touching upon these principles only. So these principles include adjacency pair, openings, closings, turn taking, repair, and institutional talk. So let's talk about the first principle, adjacency pairs. So what is this? One particularly important principle used in CA or conversation analysis is the adjacency pairs. Utterance types of certain kinds are found to co-occur. For instance, a greeting leads to a return of greeting. A summon leads to a response. A question leads to an answer. A request or offer leads to an acceptance or refusal. A complaint leads to an apology or some kind of rejection. A statement leads to some kind of conversation or recognition. A compliment leads to acceptance or rejection. A farewell leads to a farewell, and so on. So, some of the pairings provide a choice. For example, you can either accept or reject a compliment. However, not all second parts are equally preferred. Certain types of responses are preferred. For example, acceptances over refusals, answers over non answers or silence, and so on. A dispreferred choice is a marked choice and may cause disruption to the conversational flow. These dispreferred responses tend to require explanations. For example, if a friend asks do you want to go out for a drink tonight? You might mark your dispreferred rejection of the invitation with a discourse marker along with an excuse to provide an indirect refusal. Oh, I would love to, but I have to study for a test. So, a researcher, Shegloff, observes that it is important throughout this discussion of preference and dispreference to keep clearly in focus that this is a social interactional feature of sequences and of orientations to them, not a psychological one. Preferred and dispreferred refer to a structural relationship of sequence parts. So this basic pairing relationship provides the possibilities of both continuity and exchange in that it enables both parties to say something or for these some things to be related. It also allows for options in the second member of each pair and for a kind of chaining effect. A question can lead to an answer, which can lead to a comment, which can lead to an acknowledgement, and so on. For instance, the ring of a telephone, which is a summon, can lead to a response hello with the rising intonation of a question, which thus requires an answer, and so on. These are purely linear change. But there can be other types of chain, as when a question, answer, or topic comment routine is included as a subroutine into some other pair, as shown in the following example. So in this four-turn exchange, the first and last turns are a question and answer adjacency pair with an additional question and answer pair embedded within this sequence. So for instance, your friend asks you, are you going to attend John's party on Saturday? You say, rather you ask, are you? Your friend responds, yes. And then you ask again, are you? I wasn't sure, but if you are going, I'll go. So, see, basically, adjacency pairs is this question and answer relationship. You ask somebody a question which will lead to an answer. So, it has proved possible to plot the structure of many conversations using these ideas of pairing and chaining in order to show how dependent we are on them. We can also show this same dependence by acknowledging what happens when there are violations. For instance, not responding to a question, not offering a comment when one is solicited, not acknowledging a request, not exchanging a greeting, and so on. People are considered rude if they do not greet appropriately, for instance. In classroom interaction, teachers expect that students will respond to their questions. Lack of response may be penalized in some way. So basically, when somebody asks you a question, so you are expected to answer it. And if you will not answer, it will be considered rude. And in the setting of a classroom, when the teacher asks you something, you are supposed to answer, otherwise, you will be penalized for it. However, there is some controversy over whether there is such a basic two-part exchange. There are certain researchers who hold the view that a basic exchange has three parts. So the earlier researchers they said it has only two parts. So a question and then answer. But there are other researchers who say there is basically this three parts exchange. Initiation, response, and feedback, IRF. So in this view, unless some form of feedback occurs, the total exchange is incomplete. So according to these researchers, when somebody asks you a question, you respond, then some sort of acknowledgement or feedback should be there. Otherwise, this exchange would be considered incomplete. So, there is a researcher who argues for such a three-part exchange in which a following move of some kind closes out the sequence. A potentially three-part exchange, which may contain non-verbal component parts, is more adequate than an adjacency pair as a basic unit of conversational organization. So, according to some researchers, any conversation should have these three parts: initiation, response, and feedback. The second principle of conversation analysis is openings. So, the beginning of a conversation, or in other words, opening, will generally involve an exchange of greetings. Telephone conversations are often opened with each party saying hello, whereas a meeting between strangers might require a more formal sequence. For example, I'm X, nice to meet you, and you can get a reply, a pleasure, my name is Y. A meeting between close friends may have its own special ritualistic beginning. Much of this preliminary part of a conversation is highly prescribed by cultural setting. How you answer the telephone varies from group to group. Greeting exchanges involving the use of names or address terms vary enormously, like who speaks first, what a suitable reply is, and what variety of language is employed may also be tightly constrained by circumstances. So, to briefly return to the subject of answering the telephone, we can illustrate a little of the variety we find. Shegloff has described a template for telephone openings in American English in terms of four adjacency pairs. First, there is the summons and response. For instance, the phone ringing and picking up the phone and giving a brief greeting, often just hello. Next comes the identification sequence, which could be something like, is that Janet? Yeah. The third part is an exchange of greetings token. Hi, hi, and finally ritualized inquiry after the other's well being. For example, how are you? Good. How are you? So this there is of course cross linguistic and cross cultural variation in the patterns of openings, but what Shegloff just described in this example, that is done typically in American English. So there are four types of exchanges in American English. So for instance, you call somebody, you say hello, you will get a response. Then there could be, the identification sequence like who are you, or you can name the person like is this Jane, is this Janet, and the other person would respond yes. And the third part is the exchange of greeting tokens. Okay, oh, okay, Jane, how are you doing? Then she would respond to you. And then finally, you can ask like some other questions. But there could be variations across cultures in this pattern. For instance, in Japan, picking up the phone is seen as a turn, and it is the caller who speaks first on the phone, and in doing so, identifies him or herself. So, in Japanese culture, the caller should speak the first. In the Netherlands and Sweden, people usually answer the telephone by identifying themselves. So in Sweden and Netherlands, when you call somebody, so the speaker would identify themselves first. In France, a telephone call is an intrusion, or the caller feels some obligation to verify the number, identify himself, and be excused for intruding. So, see, it varies from cultures to cultures. So let's talk about a brief research on openings. So there is this researcher, Nick Azim, who carried out a research on openings of telephone conversations with three different cultures. Number one, conversations between native speakers of German in Germany. Number two, conversations between native speakers of Farsi in Iran. And number three, conversations between native speakers of German and Iranian non native speakers of German in Germany. So, what she found was that the Iranian "How are you" sequence tended to be more elaborate and include inquiries after the health of family members, while among native speakers in Germany, the ritual inquiry about well being was sometimes entirely absent. So, the German people, like the native speakers, they did not inquire about each other's well being as we Pakistanis or the Iranians do. So, when it was present, it was brief and relatively formal. When Iranian non native speakers of German talk on the phone with native German speakers, they often use the patterns from their native language and therefore inquired extensively about the health of the other's family members. So, because of this lack of fit between expectations of the two interlocutors, these openings were in some cases less smooth than those between native speakers who spoke exclusively either German or Farsi. So, in other cases, the native German speakers interpreted the inquiries after family members not as ritualized parts of the opening, but as topic introductions and provided detailed answers instead of formal responses. So, the third principle is closings. Conversations must also be brought to a satisfactory close. An abrupt closing, for example, hanging up on someone during a phone call or just simply being somehow accidentally cut off, may lead to dissatisfaction or bewilderment. Quite often, the closing itself is ritualistic. For example, both parties simply saying goodbye, so that is closing. But such rituals do not come unannounced. They are often preceded by clear indications that closings are about to occur. So, at times, before closing your conversation formally, you might give certain hints or indications which might show that you are about to end your speech. So, all topics have been exhausted and nothing more remains to be said. But it is not quite the same to exchange farewells. It is into such places that you fit pre closing signals, which serve to negotiate the actual closing. Such signals can involve an expression like, "Well, I think that's all." Or you can say, "I'll let you go for now." Or be a brief, deliberate summary of some earlier agreement. They may also include a personal exchange like, "Give my regards to your wife," or "It was great meeting you." Alternatively, these signals may take the form of a gesture or a physical movement, such as rising from a chair or adjusting physical posture in some way. So, at times, your gesture or your posture might also give a hint to the other person that you are about to close your conversation. So, they signal that the conversation is being closed, with final closure waiting only for a ritual exchange. So once conversationalists arrive at the pre-closing stage, specific acknowledgement of that fact must be made if somehow the conversation does not actually close. "Oh, by the way, I have just remembered," or "something else has just occurred to me." So at times you might hint the closing, but you might remember something else. You want to add something else to your conversation. So you might say some phrases like, "Oh, by the way, I have just remembered," or "something else has just occurred to me." So, an actual closing may involve several steps. The closing down of a topic, for example, so that's agreed, or 1 o'clock, then repeated by the other party or acknowledged in some form. Then possibly some kind of pre-closing exchange, for example, okay, okay. A possible further acknowledgement of the nature of the exchange, for example, good to see you, thanks again, or see you soon. And finally, an exchange of farewells, for example, bye bye. So let's see the closings differences in instant messaging versus face-to-face interaction. So there is this researcher Racklaw who examined closings in instant messaging exchange. He discovered two patterns which deviate somewhat from the patterns found in research on face-to-face interactions, both of which may be linked to the medium of communication. So the first pattern is the expanded archetype sequence in which a reason for leaving the chat is introduced and often evaluated by the other interlocutors, as shown in the example below. This expansion of the pre-closing sequences makes sense in the absence of non-verbal cues. So at times in instant messages, you might not say the formal like closing things, but you might use non-verbal cues or indications. And the second pattern, partially automated closings, goes in the other direction. So instead of providing more elaboration, it makes use of automated closing to do the work of the final closing statement. So instead of saying something formally, at times, the automated closing would work for you. For instance, if you're chatting with somebody and you say, okay, I should probably go to bed now, you might get a response, okay, sweet dreams. And then you are signed off automatically without saying further like good night, goodbye, or sweet dreams. So that is a kind of automated closing. We can see how the medium of communication influences the patterns, but the same principles of interaction are being followed. Speakers provide notice that they are closing, and a ritual reason for signing off, such as they do in telephonic conversations and in face to face exchanges. There is another crucial aspect to conversation, that is the principles of turn taking. So, for instance, if you are talking in a gathering when you are supposed to take your own turn. Although we engage in turn taking easily and skillfully in most cases, with not too much interruption and few awkward pauses, this coordination is much more complex than it might appear. Utterances usually do not overlap other utterances, and the gaps between utterances are sometimes measurable in microseconds, averaging only a few tenths of a second. Turn taking also applies in a variety of circumstances, between as few as two participants and upward of a dozen, on the telephone as well as in face to face interaction, and regardless of the length of particular utterances or how many people want to take a turn. It seems that there must be some system of traffic rules which we are aware of since we manage the taking of turns so well. It is very rare indeed to see turn taking spelled out in advance, and this is limited to particular speech events, for example, in ceremonies or formal debates in which turns are pre allocated. Ordinary conversation employs no such pre allocation. The participants just naturally take turns. So yes, it varies from turn taking varies from situation to situation. For instance, like in ceremonies or in formal debates or parties, you already know where your turn lies. But in ordinary conversation, like you are chit chatting or gossiping with your friends or relatives or family members, so you will have to naturally take your turn. So we will see how that occurs naturally. So in most conversations, Shegloff admits that there may be exceptions. Only one person speaks at a time, and that person is recognized to be the one whose turn it is to speak. At the conclusion of that turn, another may speak, but there may also be slight overlapping of speaking during the transition between turns. So, yes, at times it might happen that somebody who is speaking here, he has not finished yet, and without waiting for his closing, you might start your own conversation. So, the existence of adjacency pairing assures that there will be turns. However, it does not assure that these turns will be of any particular length. Once a speaker gets a turn to speak, he or she may be reluctant to give up that turn and may employ any one or more of a variety of devices to keep it. So, at times, you might have seen people who start talking once, they do not want to end their conversation. For instance, there are different techniques or strategies they might use, like some of those might include avoidance of eye contact with listeners, so you just keep on talking and talking without having eye contact with your listener, stringing utterances together in a seamless manner, avoiding the kinds of adjacency pairings that require others to speak, employing gestures in a posture that inhibit others from speaking, and so on. So, in these ways, a speaker can exploit a turn, but such exploitation can be dangerous if carried to the extreme of hogging to the conversation, turning it into a speech or a monologue. So, if you find somebody who is not letting anybody else to participate or to speak, so that would sound more like a monologue. Or just simply boring to the listeners by not allowing them the opportunity to participate or possibly even to escape. You must be prepared to give others a turn if you expect to take a turn yourself. So always remember this rule. If you want that your turn comes, so you have to give your turn to others as well. Within a conversation, too, each turn can be inspected by co participants to see what actions may be being done through it. And all series of turns can be inspected or tracked to see what courses of actions may be being progressively enacted through them, what possible responses may be being made relevant, what outcomes are being pursued, what sequences are being constructed or enacted or projected. Well, there are also certain linguistic and other signals that go with turn taking. So, for instance, speakers may signal when they are about to give up a turn in any one of several ways or by some combination. For instance, the final syllable or final stressed syllable of an utterance may be prolonged. The pitch level of the voice may signal closure. So at times the pitch of the person shows that okay, he's about to end. For example, by dropping in level on the final syllable, an utterance may be deliberately closed syntactically to achieve a sense of completeness. Words or expressions like or something can also be used to indicate the end of a term. Finally, the body itself or part of it may signal closure. So, at times, again, your gestures might show some signal closure as well. A relaxing of posture, a gesture with a hand, or directing one's gaze at the listener. Such cues signal completion and allow the listener to take a turn. They signal what has been called a transition relevant place. We must be alert to such places if we want to take a turn. Of course, such places also offer the speaker the opportunity to select the next speaker. When there are several listeners present, A speaker may attempt to address the cues to a specific listener as to select that listener as the next speaker. So basically, speaking is not always a matter of self-selection. Sometimes a specific person is clearly being called upon to speak, even on the most informal of occasions. A speaker's use of gaze, that is, looking at a specific individual or of a name or even a plain you, may suffice, but such usage varies widely by group and situation. Sometimes, when there is no such selection, there is often an embarrassing pause, and since conversationalists in many cultures abhor silence, someone will usually try to take up the turn as soon as possible. So, the control over who speaks in a conversation is called floor management. There is a researcher who identifies different flow types, F1 being linear and hierarchical, and F2 being collaborative and egalitarian. He maintained that the former had mostly male participants, while the latter had both male and female participants. So they used conversations produced by 8 mixed gender pairs of Japanese university students to look at issues of turn taking and dominance. There was this research conducted on Japanese students just to know the issues of turn taking and dominance, and that is who gets to control the floor in conversation. They found that male speakers' self oriented conversational style and female speakers' other oriented conversational style are complementary and mutually reinforcing rather than competing. In other words, male dominance is not something predetermined and imposed on female speakers. It is instead mutually constructed by the two parties. However, turn taking norms may also vary by cultural groups. For instance, Denon identifies a New York conversational style which she labels as conversational overlap. So, what do New Yorkers do? She claims that New Yorkers like a lot of talk going on in casual conversation to the extent that they talk while others are talking. In a later book, she adds that it is supportive rather than obstructive. It is speech motivated by involvement rather than disruption. She does admit in the earlier discussion that those unfamiliar with this habit may well consider themselves to be constantly interrupted or even silenced, feeling that their turn taking principles have been violated. But this is how New Yorkers do. So let's talk about the concept of repair. Conversation in real life is not like the dialogues we see in books. There are false starts, stammers, errors, and corrections. That is what we will call repairs. Repairs occur when some kind of trouble arises during the course of conversation. For instance, an interjection by a listener, for example, excuse me or what, may be an attempt to seek some kind of clarification. This is other initiated repair. And what is self repair? Self repair occurs when the speaker speaks to clarify in some way what is being said and not being understood, or correct or further elaborate on what has been said. So basically, repair is when you correct yourself, when you give a false start to your conversation, or when you stammered, or when you think you have committed, some grammatical or syntactic error. Conversation analysis is also concerned with institutional interactions. Research on these settings shows that in certain circumstances, Some of the principles we customarily use in conversation are not used at all, or are used in special ways, or are used in an abnormal manner. So, we will talk briefly about the conversations in classroom settings and in doctors' offices. So, overall, the picture that emerges of classroom talk is one in which teachers wield a great deal of power. In traditional teacher centered classrooms, the teacher gets to ask most of the questions. And on the whole, these questions are of a very special kind. They are usually questions to which the teacher already has the answer. The format usually associated with this style of teaching is the IRF format that we talked about in the beginning of this lecture, that is initiation, response, and feedback. The teacher asks a question. So the teacher asks a question, a student responds, and the teacher gives some feedback on the answer. There are also other characteristics of questioning in the classroom setting which differ from everyday conversation. For instance, the questions are often quite addressed to a whole group of listeners, and individuals in that group are required to bid for the right to answer. Furthermore, when something is chosen to answer the question, the whole answering ritual is gone through for the benefit of all participants, not just for the benefit of the one who asked the question. So finally, the questioner actually evaluates the answer as one which is not only right in providing the information that was sought, but also right in relation to how the teacher is seeking to develop the topic. So if we look at the conversation in doctor's offices, so the doctor-patient interaction is also full of questioning behavior. But in this case, the questions are asked for the purposes of double checking and eliciting anything that might be relevant to deciding on a particular course of action. Such questioning may also be used for the purpose of classification, for instance, the name of a disease given to symptoms that have been elicited, or a course of therapy indicated as a result of psychiatric treatment or assessment. In each case, the conversation is directed towards establishing relevant facts at a level of certainty that one could never tolerate in ordinary discussion of what happened or is happening. So basically, CA does not, however, offer the only way to, to view conversation. Some researchers even object to the constraints of this approach, arguing that the role of researcher is not simply to describe, rather, the role of the researcher is also to address the issues that one faces in different conversations. So, dear students, this was all about the principles of conversation analysis. Okay, so dear students, here is this list of references that was consulted for this particular lecture, and I hope you have developed some clear concepts regarding principles of conversation analysis. If you have any question or query, feel free to ask me. Thank you and take good care of yourselves.